This story didn't scream for attention, but signs were always there, you just need to look closer. This is Hidden Witness. My many experiences with the GHOSTS on our farm growing up. When I was growing up, my family lived on a farm far away from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where you could stand outside at night and hear absolutely nothing. No traffic, no neighbors, no distant voices, just the wind moving through the fields. Our farm had belonged to my grandparents before my parents bought it. The farmhouse was old but comfortable. There was a huge red barn, a small chicken coop, a well behind the house, and acres of fields stretching farther than I could see. I loved that place. But there was one thing about the farm that nobody liked talking about. My grandmother used to say, "Don't go into the barn after dark." Whenever I asked why, she would simply say, "Because sometimes you're not alone in there." I thought she was trying to scare me. I was wrong. An isolated old farmhouse surrounded by vast fields at night, wooden barn in the distance, tall grass moving in the wind, a dirt road disappearing into darkness, one warm light glowing from the farmhouse windows, eerie rural atmosphere, cinematic supernatural horror, photorealistic 16:9. I was about 9 years old when I saw the first ghost. It happened during summer. My father had gone outside to check on the animals, and my mother was preparing dinner. I was playing near the back porch when I heard someone call my name. "Daniel." I turned around. Nobody was there. Then I heard it again. "Daniel." This time the voice sounded like a woman. I looked toward the barn. A woman was standing beside the door. She wore an old-fashioned white dress. Her hair was long and dark, and she was staring directly at me. I assumed she was a neighbor, so I walked toward her. The closer I got, the stranger she looked. She wasn't moving, not even slightly. Then I blinked. She disappeared. I ran back to the house. My grandmother was sitting in the kitchen. When I described the woman, she dropped the cup she was holding. She looked at my father. Then she said something I'll never forget. "You saw her too." A young child standing outside an old farmhouse at dusk, looking toward a weathered red barn where a pale female figure is faintly visible in the doorway, fog drifting across the farm, mysterious rural horror, cinematic realism 16:9. A few months later, strange things started happening inside the house. Every night around midnight, we heard footsteps. Slow footsteps. They started downstairs. Then they moved toward the staircase. Step, step, step. My parents assumed it was the old wooden floor settling. But the footsteps continued. One night, I woke up because I heard them outside my bedroom. I pulled the blanket over my head. The footsteps stopped. Then came 3 knocks on my bedroom door. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. A few seconds later, I heard a whisper. "Daniel." I was terrified. The next morning, my father checked the hallway. There were muddy footprints outside my bedroom. But there was something strange about them. They started in the middle of the hallway and stopped directly beside my bed. There were no footprints leading toward them, and none leading away. Dark wooden farmhouse hallway at midnight, child's bedroom door slightly open, faint muddy footprints appearing across the floor, moonlight through old windows, eerie shadows, supernatural horror, photorealistic 16:9. The barn was where most of the strange things happened. Animals would suddenly become terrified. Horses would stare at empty corners. Our dog refused to enter. Sometimes we heard someone walking upstairs. But nobody was ever there. One winter evening, my older brother and I were feeding the horses. Suddenly, every animal became silent. Not one horse moved. Then we heard footsteps above us. My brother looked at me. "Did Dad go upstairs?" I shook my head. The footsteps continued. We climbed the wooden stairs. There was nothing there. Then we heard breathing. Right behind us. We turned around. Nothing. My brother grabbed my arm. "Let's go." We ran downstairs. But before we reached the door, something whispered from the darkness above us. "Don't leave." We never went into that barn after sunset again. Old abandoned red barn at midnight. Large wooden doors slightly open. Faint lantern glow deep inside. thick fog around the building, mysterious silhouette behind the barn window, cinematic supernatural horror, faux surrealistic, 16, 9. The next experience happened when I was 12. I was walking near the edge of the cornfield when I saw a little girl. She looked about 7 years old. She was standing between the rows of corn. I thought she was lost. I called out, "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She simply pointed toward the old well behind the house. Then she disappeared between the corn. I ran home and told my mother. She immediately told me never to go near that well. I asked why. She wouldn't explain. That evening, my grandfather finally told me the story. Many years earlier, a little girl had lived on the farm. Her name was Clara. She had disappeared one summer afternoon. The family searched for days. They never found her. My grandfather looked at me seriously. Then he said, "Some people believe she fell into the old well." I asked if her body was ever found. He shook his head. No, a mysterious little girl standing alone in a moonlit cornfield near an old farmhouse, wearing a faded vintage dress, face partly hidden by long hair, mist around her feet, unsettling supernatural atmosphere, cinematic photorealism, 16, 9. Of course, being 12 years old, I eventually went to the well. I went with my brother. We took a flashlight. The well was surrounded by weeds. The stone was cracked and covered with moss. My brother shined the light inside. We couldn't see the bottom. Then we heard something. A child's voice. From inside the well. "Help me." My brother dropped the flashlight. We ran. We didn't tell our parents. But that night something happened. At exactly 2:13 a.m. we heard a little girl crying outside the house. My father went outside. He found our dog sitting beside the well. The dog was staring into the darkness. And beside him were two tiny footprints. Wet footprints. Leading away from the well. Straight toward our house. Ancient stone well behind an isolated farmhouse at night. Overgrown vines, thick fog, moonlight illuminating the opening, faint reflection of a little girl's face in the dark water. Supernatural horror, cinematic realism, 16, 9. One of the strangest experiences happened inside my grandmother's bedroom. She had an old mirror that had belonged to her mother. One afternoon I was looking at it. I saw myself. Then I noticed someone standing behind me. A little girl. I spun around. Nobody was there. I looked back at the mirror. She was still there. She raised one finger to her lips, as if telling me to be quiet. Then she pointed toward the bedroom door. I turned. The door was slowly opening. Nobody was touching it. I ran. Years later, my grandmother told me that the mirror had been in the house longer than anyone could remember. She also told me something else. The previous owner had claimed that sometimes the mirror showed people who weren't standing in the room. Old antique mirror inside a dark farmhouse bedroom, young boy staring at his reflection while a pale girl stands behind him only in the mirror, candlelight, eerie shadows, supernatural horror mystery, photorealistic, 16, 9. When I was 14, something happened that convinced my father there was something unusual about the farm. It was during a thunderstorm. All the horses suddenly began screaming. Not neighing. Screaming. My father ran to the barn. My brother and I followed him. Every horse was pressed against the far wall. They were staring at the same empty corner. My father shined his flashlight there. Nothing. Then the barn door slammed shut. The temperature dropped. We could see our breath. My father shouted, "Who's there?" A voice answered. From inside the barn. "You know who." My father froze. For the first time in my life, I saw fear on his face. He grabbed us. "Get outside." We didn't ask questions. We ran. That night, my father finally admitted that he had experienced strange things on the farm long before we were born. He just didn't want us to know. Several frightened horses inside an old barn at night, animals staring toward a dark, empty corner, barn doors shaking in the wind, faint human silhouette in the shadows, dramatic cinematic horror lighting, photorealistic, 16, 9. My grandmother eventually told me the truth. She said the farm had a history. Several people had died there over the decades. Accidents, illness, one disappearance, and one unexplained death in the barn. But she didn't believe the ghosts were dangerous. She believed they were trapped. Trapped by what? I asked. She looked toward the window. By unfinished business. She told me that Clara, the little girl from the well, appeared most often. But there were others. A woman near the barn. An old man walking through the hallway. And sometimes, a tall figure standing at the edge of the fields. My grandmother gave me one warning. If you ever hear someone call your name 3 times from the fields. She stopped. What happens? She looked directly at me. Don't answer. Elderly grandmother sitting in a dim farmhouse kitchen at night, old family photographs spread across a wooden table, candlelight illuminating worried face, mysterious vintage atmosphere, cinematic supernatural horror, 16, 9. I forgot about her warning. Until one night. I was 17. I was walking back from the barn. The fields were completely dark. Then I heard my name. Daniel. I stopped. I looked around. Nobody. Then again. Daniel. I felt a chill. Then the third time. Daniel. It came from somewhere deep in the fields. I remembered my grandmother's warning. Don't answer. So I didn't. Instead, I ran. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Fast footsteps. Running toward me. I didn't look back. I reached the farmhouse. SL slammed the door behind me. Then I heard a knock. 3 times. Knock. 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 My father opened the door. There was nobody outside. But the porch was covered in mud. And in the middle of it was a single barefoot footprint. Teenage boy standing alone in a dark farm field at night. Enormous empty landscape around him, fog rolling over crops, distant shadowy figure barely visible, moon behind clouds, terrifying supernatural atmosphere, cinematic photorealism, 16, 9. I left the farm when I was 18. I thought I had escaped everything. Years passed. I rarely talked about those experiences. Eventually, my parents sold the farm. The new owners were a young couple with 2 children. I hoped they would never experience what we had. But 3 months after they moved in, I received a phone call. It was from the woman who bought the house. Her voice was shaking. She asked me, "Did your family ever see a little girl?" I couldn't answer. She continued, "My daughter says a little girl comes into her room at night." Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She keeps telling my daughter to stay away from the well. I asked her what the little girl's name was. There was silence. Then she whispered, "Clara." Old farmhouse during a violent nighttime storm, windows glowing, shadowy human figure visible outside. Family gathered inside terrified, lightning illuminating the barn, cinematic supernatural horror, photorealistic, 16, 9. I never went back. At least that's what I told myself. But sometimes, when I think about that farm, I remember the voices. The footsteps. The girl in the cornfield. The face in the mirror. And that final warning from my grandmother. Maybe the farm was haunted. Maybe every strange event had a logical explanation. Maybe grief and childhood imagination turned ordinary sounds into something terrifying. I don't know. But there is one thing I do know. The last time I visited the farm, I stood beside the old well. I heard a little girl whisper, "Thank you." I looked down. There was no water. No reflection. Nothing. Then I heard another voice behind me. An adult woman's voice. Cold, angry, and unmistakably close. It whispered, "You shouldn't have listened to her." I turned around. There was nobody there. I ran, and I never went back. But sometimes, when the wind moves through the fields at night, I swear I can still hear someone calling my name. Once, twice, and then, a third time. Abandoned farmhouse at dawn, empty fields covered in mist, old red barn in the distance, faint silhouette of a little girl standing near the well, haunting but beautiful supernatural atmosphere, cinematic photorealism, 16, 9. Have you ever experienced something on a farm, in an old house, or somewhere far away from the city that you simply couldn't explain? Maybe some places don't forget the people who lived there. Maybe some stories never really end. And maybe some ghosts aren't trying to scare us. Maybe they're trying to warn us. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Hidden Witness for more dark mysteries, unexplained encounters, and supernatural stories. And remember, if you ever hear someone calling your name from an empty field at night, don't answer. Wide cinematic shot of an isolated haunted farmhouse and red barn at midnight, fog drifting across endless fields, old stone well in foreground, faint silhouettes of a little girl and a woman near the barn, full moon behind clouds, deeply atmospheric supernatural horror, photorealistic cinematic lighting, 16. 9. No text. Thanks for watching. If you saw what others missed, join the Hidden Witness. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the shadows.